Corporal Shaolin jogged along the trail at a steady pace. He'd run this route so often he could run it on autopilot, and as always, he thought of his fallen buddies. PVT, Lee with his goofy smile, PVT, Gonzalez always telling bad jokes to amuse the squad, Pivot, Tarn and that damn mustache he was always grooming, and his longtime buddy, Sergeant Peak, who'd given him the nickname Monk when they were still in basic. It used to annoy him, but after seeing the nicknames he hung on other Marines, it could have been worse. And he got his revenge by making Abu stick as his nickname. They'd been battle buddies in recon for almost 6 years and been to hell and back for each other. And now they are all gone. Their transport had rolled over a mine that he missed while walking point, or at least that is how it was in his head, that he missed the mine and he killed them. Reality was there was nothing he could do. The new Gaxix mines were practically undetectable without probing for them. By the time the lab rats figured out a method to detect them, it was too late for his buddies. The guilt was unbearable and got him sent back for rest and therapy. He spent 6 months there, but they didn't want to release him straight back to combat. But he was going stir-crazy and convinced to let him do the equivalent of light duty by assigning him to a 3-man listening post on Tango 3's 4th moon. Normally a job for Navy techs, his company commander had pulled some strings to get him transferred there, and the 2 Navy techs were happy to have him. While atmosphere and weather were close enough to Earth norm that EVA suits weren't needed when leaving the bunker, it was still a dangerous place. It was like Australia on steroids, nasty insects, some so small you didn't know they were there until they bit. And it hurt like hell, but it wasn't fatal. Now those damn wasp-like things were. There were plants that were not only poisonous to the touch, or if dumb enough to ingest them, some of the damn things were carnivorous and big enough to consume fauna bigger than him. There was even a tree-like flora, the ginkgo, that had tendrils tipped with thorns that delivered a neurotoxin that would take down the rhino-like vogrox. If that wasn't bad enough, the damn things would wrap around anything that brushed one of those tendrils like an earth anaconda. And you could count on one hand the number of non-hostile fauna on the moon. They could still mess you up, they just didn't go out of their way to do so. Like hippos on Earth or buffalo. The bodies of water were even worse, with several ambush predators lurking in them. He was pretty sure some of the squirrel-sized Kleem would kill you if they could. Needless to say, the techs were happy to have someone to help keep them at bay, and CPL Shao was having the time of his life exploring the area. It was like the bush training they did in the outback. All the nasty flora and fauna just made it more fun. Except for the rocks, those big flying bastards could ruin your day in a hurry. He wasn't sure if his combat armor was even strong enough to protect against those talons, let alone the teeth and bite force of the maw. Luckily, they preferred to hunt far larger prey to eat. Even the ground wanted to kill you. There was a particularly nasty creature under the sand like an oversized Terran trapdoor spider. He got lucky in his first encounter with them. A Vogrock had wandered into range and was effortlessly taken down by one. But sticking to the nearby trees avoided them entirely. Areas that looked like mud could slowly drag you down until nothing was left to be seen. He wasn't sure, but he guessed there was something at the bottom doing that. But this morning he was just out for a simple run and ran with minimal protection. Just his tough but light fatigues, chest harness carrying his radio, knife, fire starter, some water, and a couple of protein bars, and of course a couple of packers of TP. There was no way in hell he was going to tempt fate by using leaves around here. And his sidearm, loaded with Inferno rounds. The incendiary rounds worked quite well against the nasty foliage around here. He wasn't sure what it was that did it, but something brought him back from the past. There were things your body subconsciously picked up that warned of danger, but never what it was. Training and combat taught him to stop and listen when that happened. He ducked behind a rock and tried to get his bearings. After a moment of thinking, he confirmed he wasn't in a spot that contained any dangerous plants or animals. He began to move cautiously, but at an increased pace to a vantage point, with a good view of the entire valley the compound sat in. As he crawled to the edge, he saw what had gotten his attention. A small Rukan assault shuttle had landed just outside the base. His mind automatically ran through the specs for it. Crew of 2, able to carry 25 combat-ready Rukan or 100 tons of cargo. Limited range, which meant a warship in orbit or nearby. 2 pulse cannons forward-facing and a turret on the top with a single pulse cannon that had full movement to cover anything above the top of the shuttle. He then scanned the compound and muttered under his breath when he saw the Rukin inside it and saw them inspecting the several outbuildings. The door to the comms center was also open, and 4 Rukin were carrying out the bodies of his 2 comrades. They were also hauling gear to the shuttle. After a quick count, it looked like the shuttle had its full complement of troopers. 25 Rukin troopers in combat dress, and all he had was his sidearm and a knife. Hopefully, one of the techs had locked the system down before they broke in. They wouldn't be able to just transfer the stored data up to the warship. The Rukin were a reptilian-like bipedal alien with a pair of muscular legs below a torso, covered in a thick hide along the back and sides, but much thinner along the front. They had 2 unremarkable arms and a head almost human-like in appearance, if you ignored the 2 tusks sticking out from their lower jaw. He still had a chance to prevent them from just taking up the equipment and accessing it that way. First things first, the communication system uplink needed to be cut off, and taking out the transmitting tower was the best way. Fortunately, it was just over a km away, and he was able to reach it and wreck it within less than 20 minutes. But not before getting a coded message in Morse code sent out. Next was the shuttle, but he needed a distraction if he was going to get to it unseen. As he snuck down the sides of the valley, he saw something that gave him a great idea. He picked several pieces of a type of berry as he went. Once he was inside of the perimeter, he cut a pair of fronds from a bush and put the berries between the fronds. He then used the butt of his knife to smash them into a paste. After they were crushed, he added a little dirt and mixed it together into a kind of paste. He cut some leaves from another plant and trimmed them to his liking. Looking around, he found a dozen or so marble-sized peebles. He also found a nearly perfect Y-shaped branch and small stick. Careful not to get any on himself, he dropped a pebble into the mixture, rolled it until it was covered in the mix, and wrapped them in the small leaves. He did the same with all of them and put the finished pieces in another frond he'd rolled into a funnel. He rolled up the fronds with the last of the mixture. He moved as close to the open ground around the fence as he could. Taking one of the wrapped pebbles, he put it in the pouch-like leaf he'd strung between the arms of the Y-shaped branch, like the wish version of a lacrosse stick. Working his way around the perimeter, he randomly launched the pebbles into the compound, the leaves breaking open from the impact and spilling the goop-covered pebbles out. Once he made his way around the entire perimeter and launched all the pebbles as he went, he snuck to the shuttle. Hiding behind a large tree, he let out an imitation of the noise made by the 4-armed monkey-like Jakuri. The cry echoed through the trees as multiple Jakuri responded to it. It wasn't long before they caught the smell of the berry paste. The berries were one of their favorites, and they would go apeshit over them. Before long, dozens of them descended on the compound and turned it a chaotic free-for-all. They fought with each other over the paste-covered pebbles, and when a few Rukin made the mistake of getting too close, they thought they were coming for the treat and attacked them. One of them made the mistake of shooting one. The cries made by the wounded Jakuri stopped their squabbling over the treats and focused on the threat. Rukin were swarmed over by angry Jakuri, and every Rukin that shot at them just brought them to the attention of the now extremely pissed-off Jakuri. Chuckling to himself, he snuck over to the shuttle and crept up on the lone pilot, watching the chaos. Taking his knife, he stuck it into a vulnerable spot of the pilot and dropped him without a sound. Dragging him into the shuttle, he went to the cockpit, smashed the controls, and then smashed the databases from the listening post. He then took the rolled-up fronds and smeared what was left of the paste all over the shuttle interior. Dropping the fronds on the shuttle ramp, he ran for the tree line and climbed a particularly tall tree to watch the fun. It only took a few minutes before a newly arriving Jakuri caught a whiff of concoction inside the shuttle. He smiled as he listened to it, smashing things as it tried to get to all of the mixture. It was doing a far better job of wrecking the shuttle beyond repair than he had time for. He'd only had time to disable it, but they could do a workaround eventually. The Rukin had retreated into the comms center and shut the door. Over a dozen Jakuri and 2 Rukin were dead. The Rukin's hide was enough to keep the Jokeri from doing more than roughing them up. The two dead Rukin made the mistake of having their helmets off. Chuckling to himself, he thought about what to do next. He couldn't just assault the compound, even in full body armor and his assault rifle. It was suicide. He had to break them into smaller groups first. He took the opportunity to build some traps while the Rukin were still forted up. Nothing lethal, just enough to piss them off. He then laid a few false trails in different directions, built a fire on the opposite side of the base, and then returned to his vantage point. He mentally prepared himself, then fired a pair of shots in the air. Ducking down, he watched the Rukin carefully check the area for the Jokeri. They'd already left after consuming all the berry mix they could find. They fanned out and checked the compound. A couple checked to find those two Rukin were dead. Another found out what happened to the shuttle and the pilot. His yell brought their leader out to inspect the damage. A few others found his traps the hard way. One stepped in a hole just deep enough to trap the foot and leave the ankle free. As the Rukin fell, it snapped the bone of the lower leg. He screamed in pain and led several other Rukin to run into the tripwires he set. He could hear them cussing all the way up to his spot. That is when the leader realized all the damage wasn't from the Jokeri and began shooting orders to his men. They began purposefully searching the compound and found several more of his little surprises. Another found his false trail and called the leader over. He sent 6 of them to follow it. At that point, his fire put up enough smoke to be visible above the tree line. He sent another 6 that direction. He had an evil grin at the thought of just what they would find when they got there. After that, he began sending them out in pairs to search the area. 4 pairs walked in different directions and disappeared in the jungle. Another pair looked to be heading for the comms tower, and the leader remained in the compound with a soldier and the remaining pilot. CPL Shao guessed the Rukin leader would send someone to the tower. After all, the shuttle's comms were wrecked beyond repair, and they'd broken down the listening post's transmitting equipment, which he also wrecked inside the shuttle. He quickly but stealthily made his way to the tower. Knowing where he was going, let him get into place before the Rukin found the way up to the tower. He hid behind a rock pile and watched. One of them started to inspect the tower while the other kept watch. It wasn't long before the one on watch moved off towards a copse of trees just behind the rock pile CPL Shao was hiding in. He slowly drew his knife, making sure to make no noise as he did. Waiting until the Rukin was looking the other way, he tossed a small rock into the brush. The Rukin immediately turned and took cover on the other side of the rock pile CPL Shao was in. CPL Shao slowed his breathing and waited. In a moment, the Rukin raised his head above the top and intently scanned the tree line. He didn't have time to make a noise before Shao drove his knife up into the bottom of his jaw and into his brain. Shao then grabbed the harness and yanked the dying Rukin onto his side. He slit its throat to be sure and searched the body. All he found was a grenade, a knife, and some synthetic cord about 10 mm long. He thought about taking the rifle, but decided it was too bulky. Peeking over the rocks, he saw the other Rukin didn't see a thing. He crept up until he was a couple of strides away. In one quick rush, he rammed into the back of the Rukin, knocking him into the solid metal of the tower. Before he could recover, Shao drove his knife into its throat and cut off any chance of a shout. The Rukin still had enough life in him to push backwards and push Shao backwards. It tried to take a step but fell on its face. Just to be safe, Shao inserted his knife to scramble its brains. He took the same thing from the body as before and made sure the Rukin hadn't figured out how to repair his sabotage. He was making his way through the jungle to get ahead of one of the pair searching the jungle. He chuckled when he heard the screams and sounds of weapons fire from near the fire he built. He wondered how many were close enough to the water for the one of the nasty things lurking there to grab them. He'd built his fire on a little raft and pushed it right to the edge of the water. He was glad it wasn't enough to cause an attack when he did. He'd hate to have to build it again. He finally found the first pair of Rukin after 15 minutes of searching and checked the map inside his head to figure out where he was. He got ahead of them and found just what he needed. He looked around until he found just what he wanted. Hiding behind a downed log, he began to strike it with the butt of his knife in a rhythmic manner, trying to get their attention, and he was rewarded a few minutes later. They were making their way towards him, but not quite where he wanted them. so he took a branch from the ground and hurled it off to the side. The sound it made when it hit a bush drew their attention, and they turned that way. He let them take about a dozen steps before rising up and threw 3 of the stones he'd picked up earlier. 2 of the 3 struck the tree he'd been aiming for. The Rukin were close enough to draw the attention of a horde of the extremely pissed-off wasp-like things. The Rukin made the mistake of flailing around at them instead of running. That just made more of them even more agitated and became the focus of the entire hive. With their thick hides on the back and sides, they could have made a run for it with little damage. But standing still let the horde find vulnerable spots to sting them in, and before long their venom began taking effect. He could tell by the way the Rukin began to stagger around before collapsing to the ground. He watched until they stopped moving, either dead or dying, before sneaking off as quietly as possible. Last thing he wanted was those wasp things noticing him. Once he was clear, he headed out to stalk the next group. He found them climbing the side of a hill, but the route they were on was slow going. Once again, he cut through the jungle and got ahead of them. As he got close to the top, he realized exactly where he was and almost turned back. "The hell with it," he muttered to himself and slowly crawled to a spot that let him see the top of the hill. Just as he thought, nestled atop a nearby stone ledge was a very large nest. Even better, it was occupied by several hatchlings with 2 heads on long necks. He crouched in the brush and watched Rukin reach the bare top of the hill. They heard the sound of the chicks and spoke to each other for a moment. They spread out and made their way to the cliff face. He smiled, thinking they were going to find out they made a very big mistake by approaching the nest. One of the hatchlings noticed the Rukin and let out a loud cry. It was answered a few moments later by a piercing cry from outside the valley. And each time that it was repeated, it was closer. At the last one, he ducked under a bush and tried to stay as motionless as possible. A massive shadow passed over him, and he thought his eardrums would explode from the shriek it let out seeing intruders by its nest. They raised their weapons and fired, but the rock's hide was too tough. It landed close enough for one head to dart forward and grab a Rukin in its jaws. The other head then grabbed the lower half of the Rukin, and they pulled him in half. The other Rukin began to backpedal and continue firing, but the rock just thrust out a wing. The Rukin went flying over the edge of the hill upon impact. Shao waited until the rock focused on feeding the unlucky Rukin to its hatchlings before sneaking down the hill. He was about halfway down before he began to make his way to the side the other Rukin had been knocked off. He found him 3/4 of the way down, smashed against a large tree and obviously dead by the unnatural angle of his neck and head. He took the knife and grenade from the body, but it didn't have the cord. He was just about to move on when he saw movement out of the corner of his eye. It was the 3rd patrol, and they had somehow made their way into the area of this patrol. After a closer look, he understood they were following an animal trail, and it worked its way near here. He scanned the trail ahead and smiled. He thought he'd find one close to it. Judging the distance and figuring out how long it would take them to reach the spot he wanted, he could just make it. Picking up the Rukin's body, he shouldered it and made his way downhill at an angle to get ahead of them. He was beat when he got there, but he'd made it in time. He went to a spot on the trail on the other side of a large tree with dangling vines. He set the body down and posed it on the trail. He then moved behind a large rock and watched. The 2 Rukin came around the bend in the trail and saw the body. They began to make their way towards, but suddenly stopped. After conversing for a minute, they moved at a much more cautious pace. It became obvious they were looking for an ambush, but they didn't know what to look for. Shao had that evil grin on his face as the Rukin began to walk under the ginkgo tree. The one in front brushed against a tendril, and it instantly wrapped around him. As it struggled, the tendril tightened its grip and began to lift him off the ground. The other Rukin pulled out his knife and rushed to help his friend, only to find himself entangled too. Shao just hoped for their sake that the neurotoxin killed them before the plant began to consume them. He watched for a moment as more and more tendrils wrapped around them and lifted them into the upper parts of the tree. Grabbing the helmet off the corpse and tying it to his harness, he went to stalk that last patrol. It was over an hour before he caught up to them, and another 10 to circle around a patch of that mud. He gently tossed the helmet into the middle of the mud patch. Luckily, it was too light to start sinking right away. He hoped they hadn't gotten too far ahead as he let out a yell, waited a moment, and did it again. By the approaching sound, they were just heedlessly crashing through the jungle. He watched from a spot in the branches of a nearby tree. They stopped at the opening and looked around. They noticed the helmet and spread out to the sides before they crept out onto the mud. They only made it a few steps before they started to sink. They struggled to walk out, but that just made them sink faster. Xiao watched until they'd sunk to their chest before making sure they saw him walk away. That was for the techs. He began making his way towards where he'd lit the fire to see if any escaped. He practically ran into them as they were coming up the trail, but he took cover before they saw him, and they were a little distracted anyways. 2 Rukin were carrying a third between them. It was missing a leg, barely having escaped becoming lunch along with his leg. All 3 looked worn and frightened from their encounter with the water's residents. Thinking fast, Xiao ran up the trail until he found what he wanted, a thick tree that forked about chest height. It took a bit to find the long and flexible pole he wanted. He trimmed the pole and jammed it into the notch of the tree, pounding it tight with a rock, and then jamming another rock to keep it in place. Taking some of the cord, he secured the pole where it stuck out the front and back. He pulled back on the pole and it bent back perfectly. He then took the 3 knives he collected and fixed them to the pole with more cord. If his calculations were right, they were spaced just right. He affixed one of the longer cords towards the end of the pole, making sure it would hold, and carefully pulled the pole back until it was perpendicular to the road. He then secured the other end to a thick tree trunk and inspected his trap. A little dirt and leaves helped conceal the cord wrapped around a tree. It was roughly 15 minutes later when he heard them staggering up the road. He stood as motionless as possible until they reached the spot he wanted. He took his knife and sliced the cord around the tree he was standing behind. The branch whipped forward and drove the knives into their chest to the hilts. Xiao ran forward and finished them off. He took knives from 2 of them. The one in the middle didn't have one, probably left behind in his escape. None of them had grenades either. Thinking back, he counted his kills and determined there were at least 9 left, 3 at base, and the 6 that had set out to follow his trail. He set off at a comfortable pace to hopefully catch them looking for him and not hold up in the base. He skirted the base and reached the spot he laid down the false trail. Tracking 6 Rukin was pretty easy, and he caught up to them in no time. He looked at that mental map and found just the right place to engage them. He went deeper into the jungle and past them before returning to the trail. The canopy was thick enough to prevent the growth of most flora under them. Xiao started leaving an obvious trail and veered off into the jungle until he came to another animal trail. He made an obvious turn to run the trail until he reached the area he was looking for. The trail forked with one leading to water and the other deeper into the jungle. As he got closer, he began to get a scent of rotting meat. Just the thing for luring predators into a trap. He reached the sandy area after several minutes, and this time he slowed down and laid a really obvious sign that he turned to the right and ran into the jungle again. Staying way back, he circled around the edge until finding the spot he was looking for. He really hoped the creatures hadn't relocated themselves, or his safe path was worthless. He took a moment to catch his breath before backing up and sprinting over the sand to the rock wall on the other side. He looked back and saw some rippling as some of the creatures stirred, but nothing else. He climbed up the rock wall and rolled onto the top to catch his breath again. After a few moments, he got up and moved some rocks to form a spot to hide behind. He went back and cut several bushes out of the ground and dragged them back to the pile. He checked each out and used the best one to help conceal his position. He took the other bushes and placed them along the top at random distances, so it looked like several other bushes were growing along the top of the rock wall. Hopefully it kept his blind from sticking out. Once everything was ready, he took a grenade, primed it, and hurled it over the sandy area to land in the jungle. The explosion echoed through the air and sent up a small puff of smoke. He then settled down to wait. After 20 minutes, he was starting to give up hope that they'd found his trail. But he began to catch just a slight noise of someone or something trying to move quietly through the jungle. He saw the first Rukin scouting ahead and then turning to wave the others on. Once they caught up, it looked down, and Xiao smiled at seeing them follow his trail. The Rukin on point was almost to the spot he'd crossed the sand. It was time to bait the trap. Xiao drew his sidearm, and in one smooth motion, he stood up and fired a shot at the pointman. The bullet hit the tree next to the pointman, with the next 3 shots missing as well, or at least the pointman would think they'd missed. He hit each of the 4 targets he aimed at. He wanted them to think he was a lousy shot, and they had little to worry about. At the pointman's signal, the other 5 spread out and began to cross the sandy spot. It didn't take long for them to stumble into the range of the things hiding under the ground. Sand sprayed up as the creatures burst up from their sandy lairs and began dragging the screaming Rukin down with them. 2 of them stood at the edge of the sandy area, shocked by what they saw. He rose up again and put 2 shots into both of them. This time he took the long way around the sand to reach the Rukin he shot. They were a mess with large holes in their chest that were cauterized by the heat of the inferno rounds in his sidearm. He still moved with caution as he approached them and put a bullet in their heads to be sure. Searching the bodies, he took the knives and grenades, but left everything else. Only 3 left to eliminate, but he hadn't come up with a plan yet. Being inside the compound, he couldn't exactly lure them into one of the dangerous areas in the jungle. As tired as he was, he had to jog back to base if he wanted to be back before dark. He really didn't want to still be in the jungle when that happened. That's when it became really dangerous. He reached the compound just before the local sun dipped below the horizon. He followed the fence line until he came to the gate, hidden behind a storehouse. Once inside, he took the time to drink some water and eat a protein bar. He saw there was a light inside the shuttle. Were they trying to repair something? He was about to step out when he heard the sound of someone walking the perimeter. It was the last Rukin soldier, which meant the leader and the co-pilot were either in the shuttle or in the comms bunker. He sat and watched the guard make his slow way around the perimeter twice before opening the door. Sticking to the shadows, he stalked the guard until reaching a good hiding spot. Then he waited for the guard to walk the perimeter again. He waited until the guard had passed his spot before leaping out, pulling the guard's head back and slitting its throat. It grasped at the slit in his throat for a moment before slumping down. Xiao crept over to the shuttle ramp and made his way inside. The CO pilot was trying to jury-rig the shuttle's comm system. After a quick peek towards the comms building, he took one of the grenades, armed it, and set it just inside the shuttle's hatch. He then sprinted behind a stack of boxes that provided cover from anyone leaving the comms building or the shuttle. He hoped their grenades weren't the type that only exploded on contact. Just as the thought crossed his mind, a spectacular explosion blew out the cockpit window and set the shuttle interior aflame. The door to the comms building slammed open as the leader ran out and towards the shuttle. It stopped in disbelief, and that is when Xiao fired 3 shots at the leader. It had impressive reflexes, diving for the ground at the sound of the discharge, but not fast enough. He took 2 in the side, but still had some fight in him. He struggled to get up and draw a weapon at the same time. Xiao sprinted over and kicked it in the face and then kicked it over onto its back. He raised his sidearm and put 2 in the chest and 1 in its head. He scanned the compound and slowly made his way to the open door of the comms shack. He peeked around the corner and made sure it was empty. He mentally added up his kills and determined he got them all. He slumped down against a wall and promptly fell asleep. He was exhausted and no longer had adrenaline pumping through his veins to keep him up. It was light out when he was awakened by a sound. After a moment, he recognized it as the sound of thrusters from a descending shuttle. But he couldn't make out if it was more Rukin or his message got through and the cavalry was here. He gave a big sigh and staggered up. Checking his sidearm and reloading it, he moved to the door. Only one way to find out, he said to himself, and stepped through the doorway.